Hey guys, in the shop here, I'm working on a hand-forged spring steel chef's knife, and it is in the final couple minutes of the heating for the hardening process. It's heated up to 1,475 degrees and then quenched. So I have a container of quenching oil here. It's actually a 50 millimeter ammo can, which I found works quite well because you can close the lid on it and seal it when you're not using it, and it also provides enough depth for most knives. So immediately from the kiln to the quenching bath, obviously, so that you're actually quenching it at that 1475 degrees. So I wanted to talk a little bit about forged knives, and particularly knives that are forged from repurposed or upcycled materials like this one is. And when you're quenching, you want to make sure you get it down to about 150 degrees, so you have all that heat out of it, so it's got an adequate cooling process to make that steel hard. So this knife started out as a piece of vehicle spring steel, and that's cool to the touch, so that's probably good. Obviously, set that down for a minute. I'm going to grab the piece of spring steel this knife came out of. So here it is right here. So this end is where I forged the knife out of, and this is the end of the tang after I cut it off and continued working on the knife. So this is a piece of spring steel. Often, or even perhaps usually, spring steel is 5160 steel, which is considered a medium or even high carbon steel. It's got about 0.6% carbon in it, and it also has a little bit of chromium and stuff like that. So it's not stainless. It's a little more stainless than just straight carbon steel would be, and it's also a little more it's a little tougher steel, which is one of the reasons why they use it for springs. So it makes pretty good knives. It makes good knives if it's used properly, and that's what I want to talk about. So this is the chef's knife here, and it's rough ground. It's just been hardened, and it's going to need to be tempered and finished ground. So if you're in the market for a hand-forged knife, when you come across something that's spring steel or some kind of repurposed, like maybe a file, I want to talk about what that takes to make a good knife out of spring steel, and the pricing that might come along with that. So this is good steel. However, you can have great steel and work it improperly or heat treat it improperly, and it will make a really lousy knife or tool or whatever you're trying to make out of it. And the reason for that is, on the molecular level, the way you heat treat your steel absolutely controls how it performs, if it's good steel to begin with. This steel being about 0.6% carbon, that's plenty of carbon to do what you need to do to get a hard enough blade to cut with and hold an edge. However, there's some nuances to this whole forging thing that you may not be aware of. So when you make a knife out of a piece of steel stock, just a flat piece of steel, this one is an example of a piece of 440 steel, by a piece of flat bar stock, and completely profile it and grind the edge and all of that. Steel from a reputable source, it'll come to you when you order it in an annealed state, which is the softest state that it can be in. And it's usually around between 20 and 30 Rockwell hardness, which is very soft, which is great because it makes it a lot easier to work. Okay, so once you've done most of the grinding, put your handle pin holes in it and everything like that, then you heat treat it. I always run a normalizing cycle on my knives before I do the hardening process, and I do this because it helps tighten up that grain structure on that steel, and it's kind of like a pre-hardening process. And it also helps relieve any internal tension that you may have caused from taking off comparatively large amounts of steel. If you didn't want to do the normalizing process, you could get away with it and your knife would be just fine most of the time if you're using steel stock as I just described. And you could go straight to hardening and then tempering, and you probably wouldn't even notice the difference. I like to do the normalizing cycle. I'm just trying to make sure I have the best process that I can. However, that is not true when you're forging any kind of steel. And here's why. When you forge steel, it has to be at a temperature that's high enough that's not going to damage the internal structure of the steel, which can happen if you hit it or hammer on it under too low of a temperature. Because instead of being plastic and squishing out, essentially, it's kind of trying to hold against that pressure, and it can literally damage the internal structure of the steel. So you have to forge steel at a high enough temperature, and usually that's about 1700 degrees, give or take. So that's necessary to avoid potentially damaging your steel and thereby making a crummy knife. So once you forge your knife at the forging temperature, and depending on the steel it varies, I forged this right around 1700 degrees. Once you do that, you run into another issue, and that is when you forge at the proper temperatures, which is higher temperatures than normal heat treating, you have enlarged the grain structure of the steel. And that's not good, because that does not give your steel the most strength and toughness that it can have. So if you go straight from forging temperatures and your blade cools down or whatever, and then you heat it back up to heat treating temperatures and go from there, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a lot weaker blade than you would otherwise. And so taking what would be even if you buy a good piece of steel, from a supplier, and you do that, you're going to greatly decrease the quality. So here's how you fix that. Normalizing, okay? This was normalized 3 times, okay, after forging. And what that looks like is heating it up to quenching temperature, so what the temperature that you would heat it up to when you're going to harden it, or slightly less. This I did at 1450, okay, so you heat it up to 1450 and let it air cool, okay, and you do that 3 times. That's what I do, is 3 times whenever I forge a blade, okay, and normalize it 3 times. And each time you do that, it pulls that grain structure back down a little bit more. You can't heat it up to forging temperatures or let it cool. It has to be that lower temperature, because that's that critical temperature where basically the carbon enters the structure of the steel sufficiently to, when you quench it, and this is very simplistic, but is trapped in that structure and creates the hardness. Okay, so normalizing. So basically, so as you can see, that adds at least a couple heat treat cycles to the entire process. Okay, so even though this blade is made from upcycled or recycled materials that I got for free, it's actually more expensive to make than just buying a piece of steel that costs probably $10 to make the knife out of, because I'm taking more time, I'm using more energy, electricity and that kind of thing to make this happen, to make a good blade. So just because it's recycled steel, to make a good knife out of that stuff is actually more expensive. So maybe you didn't know that. So this is information I'm wanting to pass on. So like I say, at this point, this is going to be tempered, and it's going to be tempered twice for 2 hours. So 2 hours at tempering temperature, take it out, cool it down to room temperature, and back in for 2 hours. And this being 5160, that's, you know, you're going to temper it between like 350 and 375. So anyway, just a little bit of information into the world of knife making. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and have a great day.